Deep in the mountains of the western wilderness, the elusive spirit of wild, untamed North America still runs free. Once horses roamed free throughout the world. Now banished by civilization to a few remote outposts, they make a final stand against the unforgiving pressures of progress. And their days, like their numbers, are in danger of vanishing forever. In North America, the wild Mustang, once numbered in the thousands, ruled the West and became a symbol of frontier freedom. But now, they too stand firmly on the brink of extinction. "55 million years ago, the evolutionary journey of the horse began here in North America. Its prehistoric lineage can be traced back to a small, dog-like creature with 5 toes that over time would adapt to the Great Plains and ultimately a single hoof. 15 million years later, descendants of the first horse began to migrate across the long-gone land bridge between Europe and the Americas. As the glaciers of the last great ice age retreated 13,000 years ago, the mountain foothills became the feeding grounds for an abundance of mammoths, camels, bison, musk oxen, and large herds of pony-sized horses. Fleet of foot and quick of ear and nostril, they were well adapted to life on the open steppes. But 2,000 years later, the North American horse mysteriously vanished. In 1996, on the drought-stricken bed of Alberta's St. Mary Reservoir, local schoolteacher Shane Tolman took a walk into history. Glittering in the sand, he found a spearhead. Looking closer, he found dozens more, and beside them, animal footprints. And then he found what made them. The bones of a wealth of Ice Age animals. Rarest of all were the skeletons of prehistoric wild horses. Intrigued with the news that animal remains and human artifacts had been found in the same place, a team of scientists went to investigate what became one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in North American history. On the surface, the arid reservoir revealed an astonishing visual profile of animal and human interaction at the end of the last ice age. But as they dug deeper, their excitement grew with the discovery of new evidence that could solve an ancient mystery.
There's no other site in North America, probably in the world, that has the richness of animal tracks from the end of the glacial period. No other site like that in North America, and probably not in the world.
3 meters 50 by 75 centimeters to the east.
The other thing that's really, really significant about this site is the fact that we have horses that we can see were exploited by people. And there are archaeological sites elsewhere in North America where there are 1 or 2 horse bones. But this is the only site where we have a number of horses, stone tools associated with them, cut mark bone. We can actually see that people were hunting and butchering these animals.
Using the carbon-14 method, the site could be dated to about 11,300 years ago, when southern Alberta looked a lot like Africa's teeming Serengeti Plain, and herds of ancient animals roamed its grasslands.
We lost there for carbon-14 date.
It was also the time when many of these remarkable creatures began to inexplicably disappear. Although several unproven theories exist, the horse skeletons and native artifacts found together at the site are the first solid evidence that hunting was a contributing factor. 14,000 years ago, big game hunters from Siberia crossed the Bering Land Bridge to a new world. Using simple stone-tipped spears, the first North Americans were fearless predators, but no evidence existed to suggest they were also hunting wild horses.
These points were all found at the site. These two actually had horse protein residue on them, and that's the key thing. When you find the people's tools, in particular weapon tips, covered in the protein residue of the horses, well, there you are. That's pretty clear proof that they were actually using these in hunting the horses.
The lure of a constant water supply for hundreds of animals made the banks of the ancient river valley an ideal ambush site. Spear tips found and dated here prove that human hunters were doing just that as far back as 13,000 years ago.
It's telling us a slice of our history that we had no clue about really before at all. And of course, because some of this stuff is totally unique, it's giving us a slice of, late Pleistocene, early Holocene, right at the end of the Ice Age, a slice of animal and human history at that time. The issues about how the horses went extinct here in North America is complex. At the end of the Ice Age, there's a great deal of change that's happening in the environment. And into that, you throw suddenly a new predator on these animals, and that would be humans. Then maybe that tips the scale, just in terms of, being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Only mute bones, scarred by stone cutting tools, speak of his origins and perhaps his extinction. But 11 millennia later, the journey of the North American horse would continue. In 1519, conquistador Hernando Cortés reintroduced the horse to its evolutionary birthplace on the east coast of Mexico. The breed was called the Spanish colonial horse, and it would help shape the destiny of a continent. In 1808, the first white man to cross the Canadian Rockies and enter the Namaya Valley reported meeting Indian warriors on horseback here, riding swiftly across the plateau. Today, not much has changed for the Gwet'in First Nation, who can't remember a time or a life without horses. "250 years after its reintroduction, the Spanish horse had been adopted by First Nation tribes from Texas to Canada. Settlers' horses added to the bloodline, and by the 18th century they numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They called the breed a Mustang, from the Spanish mestina, meaning wild, unbranded horse. Settlers called them feral trespassers who stole grass from their cattle. And in British Columbia alone, over 10,000 were killed. But inside the territory of the Gwet'in, about 150 still prevail. Isolated deep in the interior, the land of the Gwet'in is the Brittany Triangle, a rare, pristine ecosystem that has never experienced the effects of logging or mining. Towering above is Mount Silosh, whose legend says that pointing at it will bring a terrible change in the weather.
To us, it's a sanctuary for the wild horses, for the people. It has been the way it is before European contact, and today it's still the same. We always hunted, we always fish, we always food gather, we always prepared for the winter. A lot of our people, use the land, live off the land. Even there's stories of how we used to gather, go into other Chilcotin communities, and I always seem to remember that horses is always part of the Chilcotin, part of the Gwet'in people.
Unlike the beaver or bear, in Canada the wild western horse isn't classed as wild, or even the Mustang, although its origins or genetics have never been studied. But to the people who've lived here for thousands of years, it's one of nature's gifts that helped create one of the last surviving horse cultures in North America.
In the Brittany Triangle, those wild horses are there for us to take when we need it. We use it as transportation. We use it as recreation. Our forefathers before us have used those and trained these wild horses. And these wild horses being part of us is something that we don't want to lose.
Until the first and only road was built in 1973, the only way in or out of the valley was on horseback, a journey that could take a week. Today, ancient horse trails are still the preferred highway, made by the wild mustangs of the Xeni people. Recognized in the United States as an indigenous breed, mustangs are smaller and lighter in the hindquarter than the modern quarter horse. Marked by long tails and generous forelocks, its Spanish origins are most notable in the convex profile of its Iberian head. Well adapted to life in the wild, the Mustang's historic role in the culture of the Gwet'in has withstood the test of time. The Gymkhana, or horse competition, is a traditional source of recreation and equestrian training for the Xeni people and their wild mountain horses. Barrel racing is a popular sport, and the corral, like the baseball diamond or hockey arena, is a common social gathering place. Harry Sita is the warden of the Namaya Aboriginal Nature Reserve and a respected horse trainer who's captured many of the band's current wild stock.
This is a cayuse. It came from the Canny Lake side hill, and I caught him when he was 1 year old. He's 5 years old right today, and look at him. We got a lot of uses for these horses. Horses like a cayuse, we use them for mountains, pack trips, things like that.
It's ironic that Harry would use the word cayuse to describe a native horse. It comes from the Cayuse Indians, a tribe that ceased to exist a long time ago.
The only mechanic you have to do on these horses is just put shoes on them. That's all you do. And no flat tires. You can go 12 hours a day. You don't have to worry about gas or breakdowns. Or these guys just need grass and water. That's about it.
The building of the road has forced a change to the legend of Mount Silosh. Now it's said that if a newcomer points at it, their vehicle will break down. Time is catching up to the Namaya Valley, and a culture rich in tradition and horses.
Our people have been using horses as far as I can remember, all the time. You're talking about moose and deer, that's part of our survival. And anything that happens on the land that affects them will affect us. The same with the wild horses. If something happens to the land that affects them, it's going to affect our livelihood.
The Gwet'in may be able to harness their future, but for the wild Mustang, the journey remains precarious, until their legend can become scientific fact. Ranches on the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountains were founded by men on horseback. Cowboy culture is still alive and well here, and celebrated in towns like Dog Pound, Alberta, site of one of the world's oldest rodeos. Like the First Nations of the Great Plains, the first cowboys also rode the Spanish pony called the Mustang. Now the larger American quarter horse is king. But a century ago, it was the wild Mustang who bucked the hardest and drew the crowds. Today, only a few small herds remain, and their place in frontier history almost forgotten.
I learned to ride before I learned to walk. 94 years ago, my mother used to take me with her on the saddle horse, and you know, we had enough wild horses at that time. They were really beautiful. They'd stand on a ridge and they'd watch you. They wasn't afraid because nobody ever bothered them until the meat hunters started chasing them. They wasn't any wilder than the other animals. Now they're the wildest thing in the bush. And pretty well the scarcest too.
The eastern slope is a vast territory of ancient rock and lush valleys, ideal for grazing cattle and horses. Deep in the foothills, Hummingbird Ranch is the home of Slim Davis. Born and raised at a mountain's foot, Slim grew up alongside the Stoney and Blackfoot Indians, tribes whose culture flourished with the arrival of the horse. He saw his first Mustang in 1920 and remembers a time when thousands roamed wild and free.
I rode that saddle thousands of miles. I liked it for roping horses because it was good and strong and you don't have to cinch it too tight. I roped a lot of horses with that saddle.
It was a lot easier for Slim to saddle up 80 years ago, but once on, it's still tough to buck him off.
It don't.
Slim's no scientist, but a lifetime in the Rockies has made him a wildlife expert in his own right. And during most of it, he's fought hard to protect the wild Mustang.
Well, rangers don't do anything to protect the wild horses. The government won't either. I tell you, I've been to meetings over these here different things. The guys that have the say has never been here. They've never seen it. And yet them's the guys that make the laws.
Like British Columbia, Alberta considers all wild horses to be feral and allowed thousands of them to be killed off. In 1974, Slim convinced the government to outlaw hunting them on public land, but their numbers still declined. And now it's rare for even Slim to see one.
There never was a big bunch of wild horses. There used to be many little bunches. The only natural enemy that wild horses he got is the wild horse hunters. Cougar might kill the odd colt, but not likely. And the wolves just can't get into a pack of wild horses. When there were lots of wild horses, there were lots of mule deer, because when the wolves would bother the deer would run to the horses. So that was just nature's way of doing things.
In man's world, a bighorn mountain ram is worth a small fortune to a trophy hunter. But after fall hunting season is over, goats, deer, and moose are all protected by strict wildlife laws, while the wild horse remains fair game. In the United States, wild horses have been protected since 1959, but here in the heartland of the Canadian West, it's still legal to shoot a wild horse on private land and sell it for dog food.
Well, how come we're still here?
Slim's too old now to take his fight to the government. But like the horse he still champions, he's become a living legend, drawing people to the ranch to listen and learn firsthand his version of rough-hewn natural history.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Hey, Slim, how about a palm?
When you start up a trail on the day you're born, with many a curve and bend, you don't know where it'll lead you, and you don't know when it'll end. But when you come to the end of the trail, there's nothing there to fear. Your spirit will leave your body, and your spirit will still be here.
Haunted by visions of trails plowed under, today old cowboys can only dream that some things, priceless, will survive the steel wheels of progress.
I'd like to see the wild horses protected, what's left of them. Well, I'd like to see them left anyway, some, you know, because they're not hurting anything, and they got a right to be here. They was here before people was. And these guys say, well, their horses have got away, you know. I know better than that.
In the rodeo or on the range, Slim's ridden with the best of them. His trail may be coming to an end, but at least he knows that somewhere out there the last wild Mustangs still run free. In 1895, a census taken of the Alberta wild horse population counted over 42,000 head. Today, about 300 remain. After running for a century from the pressures of progress, their behavior, like their numbers, has changed dramatically. Extremely sensitive to every sight and sound, they now prefer thick forest cover to graze in rather than the open range. But so far, they've beaten the odds, prevailing over hunters, harsh weather, intense grazing competition, and a high infant mortality rate, conditions that domestic rejects couldn't survive for even a decade. In the lexicon of nature, these are wild horses. They travel in small bands of mares and colts, ruled by a stud horse or stallion. He maintains his band year-round and controls it with an iron will. The band will establish a home range of about 15 square miles and mark it with manure that send a scent warning to rival stallions. The Rockies are the northern limit of wild horse country. Winters are severe, and often the snow is too deep to forage unless a warm Chinook wind decides to blow. Like the male alpha wolf, the stallion is constantly alert, watching for intruders and ready to challenge anything that approaches his harem. But it's an older mare who knows the range well, who will actually lead the band away from any threat. Foals are usually born from March to June and can run at the gallop 48 hours after birth, essential to their survival where cougars or grizzlies wait in ambush. Cowboys claim that it's impossible to break a mature wild horse. The only way is to capture them young, at a year or less. In the West, stories are still told of wild horses willing themselves to death after only a few days of being deprived of their freedom. Horses are extremely social animals, but for wild horses in particular, the band is crucial to survival. They keep together to fight off predators or to stay warm in a blizzard. Always there's a sentinel, watching for danger and allowing the rest to graze or sleep in peace. Feral horse, trespass grazer, and wild mustang are sensitive issues in the Canadian West, where the right to graze cattle on public lands is a jealously guarded asset. Eldon Bruns is a wildlife biologist with the Alberta government. Well versed in horse behavior, he's uncomfortable calling them wild, like the elk, wolf, or grizzly he's observed here for the past 20 years.
We've got around 300 head of horses. It probably has been up to 1,000 in the past. So the government is trying to maintain them roughly at that level for the last several years. If an area seems to be increasing, they will allow ranchers, outfitters, cowboys that are interested, they will allow them a permit for a designated area to come in and catch wild horses.
The government's mandate here has never been to define the terms wild or feral. It's politics and money. Every year, large tracts of public grassland are leased to the cattle industry, and grass eaten by a wild horse is that much less to feed the insatiable appetite of 100,000 head of beef. The ecological impact of 300 wild horses seems small, but they still create a big problem. Under pressure from both ranchers and conservationists like Slim Davis, Alberta now tolerates small bands of horses on public land, but remains indifferent to proving that they could be a natural treasure.
As far as tracing their genetics back to the original Spanish Mustangs, there probably is a little trace in there, but it'll be pretty thin. But all the horses in the wild horses in Alberta should technically be called feral horses. They're horses that were at some stage domesticated, released. There are several generations out here now probably that haven't been handled by man, but the original stock was definitely introduced.
The question is, who introduced it? A rancher or a conquistador? Since the West was opened, Though the number of wild horses has dwindled drastically, it has never completely vanished. Historically, the bloodline can still be traced unbroken from 16th century Mexico to present-day Alberta as one genetic heritage. But since no one has ever genetically tested a wild horse in the Canadian West, no one really knows for sure. Like the old Hollywood westerns, the Mustang is still part fact and part fiction. Duane Papke has been a mountain guide and outfitter for over 30 years. He's a new breed of cowboy and runs a successful ranch for tourists near Banff, Alberta's famous national park.
Come on, boys. Come on, boys. Come on, boys. Come on.
Every summer, people from around the world come here to experience the lifestyle of the Old West. A big part of the draw are the elusive bands of wild horses who found refuge in the remote backcountry. Like a lot of modern cowboys, Duane's skeptical of their Spanish origins, but he can't deny their important role in his own Western heritage and his business.
I have a great love for the wild horses. It is adrenaline pump to see that animal in the wild, free, and fighting the elements to exist, and which carries on today. You'll go through a valley where you might see 50 to 60 head of these wild horses, and they're just little different bunches. To me, that is one of the greatest views that you want to set your eyes on.
Duane's backyard is known as the Yahatinda Ranch region, most of it remote, unspoiled public land, ideal for wild horses.
There's a few more people in the area besides myself. We felt that these numbers of the wild horses should be maintained to where we have this value of taking people out to see these wild horses. You look at some areas with easy access, we find that the numbers dwindle in them areas a lot faster than the more areas that are rugged and hard to get at.
The Yahatinda is a designated wilderness preserve, and the only grazing competition for wild horses here are other wild animals like the elk. Ironically, it too is a reintroduced animal, but strictly protected. "30 years on this range has made Duane one of the best horse trackers in the business, and when he finds unshod footprints, he can usually follow them right to the source."
It's just a 4-year-old stud. He's all by himself. The reason he come in to look at us is here as we spooked him off of the flat. Being by himself, he's pretty leery of us.
Moving slow and careful, Duane follows the young stud's trail. He could be part of a band of bachelors driven from their herds by the dominant stallion until they're older and strong enough to assert their right to breed. Soon enough, he's proven right. High on a hill is a rare sight, a band of young stallions. But instead of running for cover, they stand and watch Duane approach. They seem intrigued by his whistling, and quite possibly have heard it before. By nature, these animals are extremely nervous, especially of man. and only the stallion will dare approach an intruder to learn whether they are friend or foe. It's a rare moment for these horses too. This is a human who poses no threat. Both the ancient and reintroduced wild horse evolved as a prairie dweller, using speed of foot as their primary survival mechanism. One false move and they're gone, in a flash. In Duane's words, it's adrenaline pumping to see a horse running free in the wild, but even in this remote backcountry, band sizes are decreasing and horses harder to find.
In Alberta here, through the wild horses and the existence of the wild horses for all these years, we feel that there could be a sanctuary set up just for these horses. To me, it's a forefather system back through heritage, and to me, my grandchildren and the future grandchildren of other people that have a love for a horse should see these running in the wild. And the wishing that they have a good future is how I look at it.
Duane even has a name for his wild mountain sanctuary. In an upland meadow at the headwaters of a glacier-fed stream, a place called Wild Horse Creek. But for the wild Mustangs of Alberta, getting there may be a long time coming. A 1,000 miles due east of the Rocky Mountains, in the heart of the Canadian prairies, lives a very special horse. Shandy is a 25-year-old Spanish Mustang. In 1976, her mother was captured in foal, not far from Duane Papke's ranch, and 6 months later, Shandy was born. She now belongs to Steve Howlett, whose farm is located in Dugald, Manitoba, about as far as you can get from the wild horse's home range, and a lot safer. Shandy was a horse with a will of her own when Steve first acquired her.
Ain't nothing here gonna hurt you.
Although born and raised in captivity, the wild mountain life seemed bred into her genes, and it took hard work and a lot of patience to win her trust.
And the first thing I remember about her was the fact that, oh my God, she's so small. My boss, an old cowboy, came up and he said, "What are you looking at?" And I said, "Well, look at her." He smiled at me and he says, "You know, you're going to wear the seat of your pants out before you wear her out." She was tough as nails. I think he's a little upset without you. Hey, honey.
Steve Howlett, it turns out, is as unique as his horse. In the United States, scientists have genetically tested wild horses extensively and found Spanish DNA in at least 3 herds. But in Canada, only Steve Howlett has spent the time and money to test a single wild horse, Shandy.
She had the same pattern as all of the sulfur horses from Utah, most of the Tigers from Oregon, and most of the registered Spanish Mustangs in the States. They all have the same Iberian pattern that modern horses don't have.
Sir.
Once he'd confirmed and registered Shandy's Mustang bloodline, Howlett began a one-man breeding program. Hoping to preserve his horse's unique pedigree, he recently brought another registered Spanish Mustang to the farm, an American stallion called Silvertip. For his small size, the stallion is extremely jealous of his mare and takes exception to any show of interest, even if a fence divides him from his rivals. The standoff is frustrating for Silvertip. He'd like to see his competitors running for the hills, but that won't happen here. These Mustangs are far from the fields of freedom. What's even more frustrating is having only one lonesome mare to bully around, instead of an entire harem.
In a lot of cases, a horse is a horse. A lot of their behavior is the same. There is kind of some peculiarities about Spanish Mustangs.
Hey, Mama, how you doing, huh?
There was a saying that not all Spanish Mustangs are wild, and not all wild horses are Spanish Mustangs.
How you doing, hon? How are you today? Huh?
A lot are ranch bred now, but they're not housed in barns. They retain the toughness, they retain their wild instincts that way. Silvertip was brought up to perpetuate her line. We're hoping for 1, 2, if we're really lucky, maybe three foals off her, that we can keep this uniquely Canadian line intact. And the more we have, the broader the genetics, the greater chance of survival these horses have.
So far, not a single scientific body has expressed interest in Howlett's one-man genetic study. And although he's fought hard to protect the wild Mustang, she goes unrecognized in Canada. Today, Shandy is a mature 25, old for a horse, older still for a broodmare, and the odds of Silvertip breeding with her successfully are slim at best.
She's the only horse from a Canadian wild herd that is registered with any of the Spanish Mustang or Spanish colonial registries anywhere. Shandy is the only living proof we have that these horses are descended from Spanish horses, that there is something special in the Rockies of Alberta and quite possibly in the Rockies of British Columbia. In the States, they seem to take great pride in the Western heritage that these horses show now. In Canada, we ignore them. I'd really hate to think that you would be the last Spanish Mustang that we have in Canada.
What if the ancient horse of North America had not become extinct 11,000 years ago? What would it look like? And would it still be wild or free? The answer may lie in its ancestors and their descendants, who now roam the world, including the new North America. Here, the wild horse called Mestina maintains a precarious hold on survival, a paradoxical symbol of freedom in a changing world. But wherever man lives on the planet, our treatment of wild horses echoes our response to all species of wildlife. And despite laws, or the lack of them, the saga continues at the horse's expense. No other creature has affected man's imagination, entered his soul, and captured his heart as much as the horse. For these reasons alone, we can't afford to lose any of them.